The moment Tucker Carlson told Ilhan Omar to go back to Somalia, live on Fox News, the studio fell deadly silent. For 3 seconds, America held its breath. Then Omar smiled, not the defensive smile of someone who'd been hurt, but the confident smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. What she said next didn't just destroy Carlson's argument. It exposed a family secret that would make every anti-immigration comment he'd ever made sound like pure hypocrisy. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of the explosive political drama we cover. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next when America's most controversial TV host gets schooled on his own family history. Comment below where you're watching from and what you think about immigration debates in America today. This wasn't just another cable news debate. This was the moment when America's immigration debate took the most unexpected turn in television history. And by the end of this confrontation, one career would be forever changed, one family secret would be exposed, and the entire country would be talking about what it really means to be American in the 21st century. The backstory to this confrontation began weeks earlier, when Omar's communications team had been approached by Fox News producers with an unusual invitation. Tucker Carlson, they explained, wanted to have what he called an honest conversation about immigration with someone who represented the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Omar's staff was initially skeptical. Carlson had a history of hostile interviews with Democratic politicians, particularly those from minority backgrounds. But Omar herself was intrigued. She had been watching Carlson's show for months, taking notes on his rhetoric and arguments about immigration. As someone who had lived through the immigration process herself, she found his characterizations of immigrants both inaccurate and deeply personal. This invitation represented an opportunity to challenge those narratives directly, on his own turf, with his own audience. What Fox News producers didn't know was that Omar had been quietly building a research file on prominent anti-immigration voices in American media and politics. It had started as an academic exercise. She wanted to understand the historical patterns of immigration rhetoric in America. But as her research deepened, she began uncovering family histories that painted a very different picture than the public personas these figures presented. The Fox News studios in Manhattan buzzed with anticipation on that fateful Tuesday evening in March. The building's lobby was filled with protesters from both sides. Immigration advocates holding signs reading, "No human is illegal," and counter-protesters with America First banners. Security had been doubled for the evening, and the network's executives were watching nervously from their offices high above the street. Tucker Carlson tonight was about to host what the network had billed as a crucial conversation about American values and immigration policy. The show's producers had promised viewers an unfiltered discussion between two of America's most polarizing political figures. What they were about to get was something far more explosive than anyone had anticipated. Tucker Carlson, 54, sat behind his familiar desk, adjusting his signature bow tie with the confidence of someone who had dominated cable news ratings for years. His pre-show routine was meticulous. He reviewed his notes one final time, checked his appearance in the monitor, and mentally rehearsed his opening questions. As the host of Fox News' most-watched primetime show, Carlson had built his reputation on fearless commentary about immigration, often positioning himself as the defender of traditional American values against what he called the invasion of foreign ideology. The show had become appointment television for millions of conservative Americans who saw him as their voice against political correctness and unchecked immigration. Carlson's sharp wit, combined with his willingness to say what others wouldn't, had made him one of the most influential media figures in America. He had interviewed presidents, challenged senators, and never backed down from a controversial stance. But tonight, he was about to meet his match in ways he never could have imagined. The makeup artist finished touching up his appearance as Carlson reviewed his strategy for the interview. He planned to challenge Omar on her policy positions, question her understanding of American history, and ultimately demonstrate to his audience that progressive politicians like her were fundamentally out of touch with real American values. It was a playbook he had used successfully countless times before. Across from him, in the guest chair, sat Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, the 41-year-old representative from Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. Born in Somalia and raised in a refugee camp in Kenya before immigrating to America at age 12, Omar had become one of the most recognizable faces in Congress. Her hijab, her outspoken progressive politics, and her willingness to challenge both parties had made her a lightning rod for controversy. Omar's journey to this moment had been extraordinary by any measure. She had fled civil war as a child, spent years in a refugee camp, learned English as her third language, and worked her way through college and law school before entering politics. Her rise through Minnesota Democratic politics had been meteoric, from community organizer to state representative to Congress in less than a decade. But Omar's success had come with a price. She had faced death threats, racist attacks, and constant questioning of her loyalty to America. Her office received more security threats than almost any other member of Congress. Tonight's appearance on Carlson's show was controversial even among her own staff, many of whom worried that she was walking into a trap. Omar had built her political career on speaking truth to power, whether that meant challenging American foreign policy, fighting for economic justice, or defending immigrant rights. She had faced hostile interviews before, but tonight felt different. She had spent weeks preparing, not just reviewing policy talking points, but digging deep into research that she hoped would fundamentally change the conversation. What made this particular confrontation so significant was the timing and the broader political context. Immigration had once again become the defining issue in American politics. The debate over border security, refugee admissions, and what it meant to be American had reached a fever pitch. Politicians on both sides were using increasingly inflammatory rhetoric, and the discourse had become more polarized than at any time in recent memory. Carlson had been one of the loudest voices arguing that unchecked immigration threatened the very fabric of American society. His nightly monologues about immigration had helped shape conservative opinion and influence policy debates in Washington. He regularly argued that recent immigrants, particularly those from non-European countries, couldn't understand or appreciate American values in the same way as people whose families had been in the country for generations. Omar, on the other hand, represented everything Carlson's audience had been taught to fear: a Muslim immigrant who had risen to positions of power and influence in American government. To Carlson's supporters, she embodied the changing face of America that they found threatening. To her supporters, she represented the American dream in action, a refugee who had become a congresswoman, proving that America's promise of opportunity was still real. The stage was set for a clash of worldviews that would expose some uncomfortable truths about American identity, family history, and the immigrant experience. Neither participant knew that this debate would become one of the most viral moments in cable news history, fundamentally changing how America talked about immigration and belonging. As the cameras prepared to roll, Omar sat quietly in her chair, reviewing the contents of the manila folder beside her. Her research team had worked for weeks to compile the documents inside, following paper trails through immigration records, genealogy databases, and historical archives. What they had discovered was more explosive than she had dared to hope. The show opened with Carlson's typical monologue, delivered with his characteristic intensity and conviction. He spoke directly to the camera, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a trusted source for millions of viewers. The studio lights cast dramatic shadows across his face as he launched into what would become one of the most significant opening segments of his career. "Good evening, and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight," he began, his tone serious and measured. "Tonight we're going to have a conversation that many in the media elite don't want you to hear. We're going to talk about what it really means to be American in 2024, and whether our immigration system is helping or hurting the people who built this country." He paused, letting his words sink in with his audience before continuing. The silence in the studio was complete, with even the camera operators holding their breath as they sensed the gravity of the moment. "For too long, we've been told that questioning immigration policy makes you a racist, that wanting to control our borders makes you a xenophobe, that believing in American exceptionalism makes you a nationalist. Tonight, we're going to cut through that political correctness and have an honest conversation about what's at stake." Carlson's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his theme. This was the kind of commentary that had made him famous, the willingness to say what he believed other media figures were too afraid to express. Joining me tonight is Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, someone who has been very vocal about her views on American immigration policy. Congresswoman Omar came to this country as a refugee, and she now serves in the United States Congress. But some of her statements and positions have raised serious questions about her understanding of American values and her commitment to the principles that have made this country great. The camera cut to Omar, who sat calmly in the studio chair, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a navy blue hijab and a professional blazer, her expression composed but alert. Years of facing hostile interviews had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but those who knew her well could see the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested she was ready for battle. Behind her calm exterior, Omar was running through her strategy one final time. She knew that Carlson would try to bait her into an emotional response, would question her patriotism, and would attempt to paint her as someone who didn't understand or appreciate America. What he didn't know was that she had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment, armed with information that would turn his own arguments against him. Congresswoman Omar, Carlson continued, turning to face her directly. You've been very critical of American immigration enforcement. You've called ICE agents Gestapo and compared detention facilities to concentration camps. You've suggested that America's immigration system is fundamentally racist and unjust. Do you think that kind of rhetoric helps or hurts the immigration debate in this country? It was a loaded question, designed to put Omar on the defensive from the start. Carlson was betting that she would either defend inflammatory statements or back down from positions she had taken publicly. Either response would serve his purposes, painting her as either an extremist or a politician who couldn't stand behind her own words. Omar had been expecting this line of attack. She had faced similar questions countless times before, and she had learned to respond with facts rather than emotion. But tonight, she had a different strategy in mind. "Tucker, thank you for having me on your show," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "I think what hurts the immigration debate is when we dehumanize people who are seeking safety and opportunity. When we separate children from their families, when we keep people in overcrowded facilities without adequate medical care, when we treat asylum seekers like criminals instead of human beings seeking protection, that's when we lose our moral authority as a nation." Her response was measured but firm, avoiding the trap of defending specific inflammatory language while redirecting the conversation toward policy substance. But Carlson wasn't satisfied with such a diplomatic answer. "But Congresswoman," he pressed, leaning forward in his chair with the intensity that had made him a formidable interviewer. "These people are breaking the law. They're entering our country illegally. They're overwhelming our systems. They're taking resources away from American citizens who need them. Don't you think Americans have a right to control who comes into their country? Don't you think we have an obligation to put American citizens first?" The questions came rapidly, each one designed to paint Omar as someone who cared more about foreign nationals than American citizens. It was a classic Carlson technique. Frame the issue in terms of loyalty and belonging, suggesting that anyone who advocated for immigrant rights was somehow betraying American interests. "Of course Americans have that right," Omar responded without hesitation, refusing to be cornered by the false choice embedded in his question. "But we also have a legal obligation under both domestic and international law to process asylum claims fairly and humanely. Many of these people are following legal procedures. They're presenting themselves at ports of entry and asking for protection under laws that America itself helped create." She paused briefly, then continued with growing confidence. "And let's be clear about something else. Immigration has always strengthened America. The idea that immigrants take away from American citizens ignores the economic reality that immigrants contribute more in taxes than they consume in services, that they start businesses at higher rates than native-born Americans, and that they often take jobs that complement rather than compete with American workers." The exchange continued for several minutes, with Carlson growing increasingly frustrated by Omar's calm, fact-based responses. She wasn't taking his bait, wasn't getting emotional or defensive in the way that would make for good television and validate his audience's preconceptions about her. Instead, she was systematically dismantling his arguments with data and legal precedent. This wasn't how these interviews usually went. Carlson was accustomed to progressive politicians becoming flustered under his questioning, either retreating from their positions or saying something inflammatory that he could use against them. Omar was doing neither. She was standing her ground while maintaining a tone that was both respectful and authoritative. That's when Carlson decided to escalate to personal attacks. "Congresswoman Omar," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge that his regular viewers would recognize as a sign that he was moving in for the kill. You talk about American values and American obligations, but I have to ask, do you actually understand what American values are? You came here as a child from Somalia, a country that has been in chaos for decades. You grew up in a refugee camp. You lived through civil war. You experienced a completely different political and cultural system. He paused for effect, letting the implications of his words settle over the studio audience and television viewers. How can someone with that background possibly understand what built this country and what keeps it strong? How can someone who didn't grow up with American traditions, American history, American culture, really comprehend what makes America exceptional? The question hung in the air like a challenge. It was the kind of statement that had made Carlson famous among his supporters and infamous among his critics. He was questioning not just Omar's policies, but her fundamental right to speak for America. He was suggesting that American identity was something that could only be understood by people who had been born into it, that immigrants, no matter how successful or accomplished, would always be outsiders looking in. The studio fell silent as the full weight of his words sank in. Camera operators adjusted their angles to capture both participants' reactions. In the control room, producers held their breath, sensing that something significant was happening, but not yet understanding what. Omar felt her heart rate increase slightly, but her expression remained calm. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, ever since her staff had agreed to the interview. What Carlson didn't know was that she had spent considerable time researching not just immigration policy and American history, but something much more personal and potentially devastating to his argument. "Tucker," she replied, her voice still steady but with a new undertone of confidence. "I think my background gives me a unique perspective on what American values really mean. I've seen what it's like to live without freedom, without opportunity, without hope. I've experienced firsthand what it means when governments fail their people, when societies break down, when the rule of law disappears." She leaned forward slightly, engaging more directly with Carlson's challenge. "I understand better than most what America offers to the world, not because I read about it in textbooks, but because I've lived the alternative. When you've experienced life without constitutional protections, without due process, without the basic freedoms that Americans take for granted, you don't take those things lightly when you finally have them." It was a powerful response, but Carlson wasn't backing down. If anything, her answers seemed to energize him, confirming his belief that she saw America from the outside rather than understanding it from within. "But that's exactly my point," Carlson interrupted, his voice rising with the passion that had made him a star. "You understand America as an outsider looking in, as someone who's grateful for what America has given you. That's admirable, but it's not the same as really understanding what America is." He gestured emphatically as he continued, his argument building momentum. "Real Americans, people whose families built this country, people who have been here for generations, people who grew up with American traditions and values, they understand America from the inside. They know what it took to build this country, what it takes to maintain it, what threats can destroy it. There's a difference between being grateful for what America has given you and actually understanding what America is at its core." The distinction was clear, and it cut to the heart of one of America's most persistent debates about belonging and authenticity. Carlson was suggesting that there were levels of American identity, that some people were more genuinely American than others based on how long their families had been in the country and how deeply they were rooted in what he considered authentic American culture. It was a moment that crystallized everything about the immigration debate, the question of whether America was defined by its ideals or its demographics, whether belonging was earned through commitment and contribution or inherited through ancestry. Omar nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully, but those who knew her well could see the slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, the telltale sign that she was about to spring a trap that her opponent hadn't seen coming. What happened next would shock not just Carlson and his audience, but millions of Americans watching at home. "That's a fascinating perspective, Tucker," she said, reaching into her briefcase and pulling out a manila folder that she placed deliberately on the table between them. "Since you're so interested in family history and who really understands America, since you believe that understanding comes from having deep roots in this country, I think your viewers might be interested in learning about your own family's immigration story." Carlson's confident expression flickered for the first time since the interview began. The sudden shift in direction had caught him completely off guard. "I'm sorry, what?" he asked, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty he had shown all evening. "Your family's immigration story," Omar repeated, opening the folder and removing several documents with official-looking letterheads and stamps. "You see, when I agreed to come on your show, I did what any good public servant should do. I did my research. And what I found about the Carlson family's arrival in America is really quite interesting." "I'm not sure what you think you found," Carlson said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. The confident media personality who had dominated thousands of interviews was suddenly finding himself in unfamiliar territory. Omar smiled, and for the first time since the interview began, she looked completely relaxed. The careful composure she had maintained while under attack was replaced by the confidence of someone who had just gained the upper hand. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I've found, Tucker. But let's share it with your audience, shall we? After all, you've built your entire argument tonight on the importance of family history and understanding where people come from." She held up the first document, a genealogy report with official-looking stamps and signatures that the cameras captured in sharp detail. "This is a comprehensive genealogy report on the Carlson family line, specifically focusing on your great-great-grandfather, Carl Carlsson, who immigrated to the United States from Sweden in 1887. Carlson's face had gone noticeably pale. The confidence that had carried him through thousands of interviews was evaporating in real time as he realized that Omar had somehow turned the tables on him in a way he never could have anticipated. "Now, Tucker," Omar continued, her voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "According to immigration records from Ellis Island, and these are public records, available to anyone who wants to look them up, your great-great-grandfather was initially denied entry to the United States. Do you know why?" The studio was dead silent. Even the camera operators had stopped moving, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. The show's producers, watching from the control room, realized they were seeing one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of cable news. "The records show," Omar continued, reading from an official document that she held up for the cameras, "that Carl Carlson was refused entry because immigration officials were concerned about his ability to support himself in America. According to the Ellis Island records, he had no money, no job prospects, no American sponsors, and officials were worried he would become what they called a public charge, essentially, that he would end up dependent on government assistance." She looked up at Carlson, whose jaw had tightened visibly as the implications of her revelation became clear. "In other words, Tucker, your great-great-grandfather was exactly the kind of immigrant that you now argue shouldn't be allowed into America. He was poor, he had no guaranteed employment, and immigration officials were concerned that he might become a burden on American taxpayers." The implications were staggering. Here was Tucker Carlson, one of America's most vocal critics of immigration, learning on live television that his own ancestor had been the kind of immigrant he regularly criticized. The irony was so perfect, so complete, that even some of Carlson's supporters in the studio audience were shaking their heads in disbelief. "But it gets better," Omar continued, clearly enjoying the moment as she reached for another document. "Carl Carlsson was eventually admitted to the United States, but only after intervention by a Swedish immigrant aid society. He was sponsored by people who had immigrated before him, people who vouched for his character and promised to help him find work." She held up another document, this one bearing the letterhead of what appeared to be a 19th-century immigrant assistance organization. "This is his sponsorship record. It shows that your great-great-grandfather relied on what we would now call chain migration, immigrants who had arrived earlier helping newer immigrants get established. The very system that you regularly criticize on this show is the system that allowed your own family to come to America." Carlson tried to interrupt, but Omar held up her hand in a gesture that commanded silence. "I'm not finished. Because here's the really interesting part. According to these records, Carl Carlson didn't speak English when he arrived in America. His naturalization documents show that he needed an interpreter for his citizenship interview. He lived in a Swedish immigrant community in Minnesota. That's right. Tucker, your ancestor was part of what we would now call an ethnic enclave. He didn't assimilate immediately into mainstream American culture." She paused to let this information sink in before continuing. He maintained his Swedish customs, spoke Swedish at home, married another Swedish immigrant, and raised his children in a community where Swedish was the primary language. According to census records, his children didn't speak English as their first language either. The parallel to modern immigration debates was unmistakable. Every criticism that Carlson had leveled against contemporary immigrants could be applied to his own ancestor. The reliance on community support, the maintenance of ethnic traditions, the slow pace of assimilation, the initial inability to speak English. Now let me read you something particularly relevant. Omar said, pulling out what appeared to be a historical newspaper clipping. This is from the Minneapolis Tribune, dated September 15, 1888. The headline reads, Swedish immigrants threaten American workers, foreign laborers taking jobs from real Americans. She looked directly at Carlson, her expression a mixture of triumph and sympathy. Sound familiar? The article goes on to complain about Swedish immigrants who refuse to learn English, who stick to their own kind, and who don't understand American values. It specifically mentions concerns about immigrants from Sweden overwhelming local communities and changing the character of American cities. The historical parallel was devastating. The same rhetoric that Carlson used against modern immigrants had been used against his own family more than a century earlier. The article even quotes a local politician saying that Swedish immigrants should go back where they came from if they can't appreciate American ways. Omar's voice carried just a hint of irony as she delivered this line. The host was clearly struggling to formulate a response. The confident media personality who had built his career on attacking immigrants was confronting the fact that his own family had faced identical attacks, had been viewed with the same suspicion, had been told to leave the country in the same terms he now used against others. This is completely different, he finally managed, his voice lacking its usual conviction. Swedish immigrants in the 1880s were coming from a stable democracy. They were Christians, they shared Western values. Were what, Tucker? Omar interrupted, her voice sharp but not unkind. Were they not foreign? Were they not taking jobs from people who were already here? Were they not maintaining their own cultural practices instead of immediately assimilating into American society? She leaned forward in her chair, pressing her advantage. Or is the difference simply that they were white and Christian, while the immigrants you attack today are primarily brown and Muslim? The question hung in the air like a bomb. Omar had just accused one of America's most prominent media figures of racial and religious bias on his own show, and she had the documentation to back up her argument. That's not. You're twisting this, Carlson said, but his usual quick wit had abandoned him. For perhaps the first time in his television career, he looked genuinely rattled. I'm not twisting anything, Omar replied calmly. I'm simply pointing out that your great-great-grandfather's immigration story is remarkably similar to the stories of many immigrants today. He came here with nothing, faced discrimination and suspicion, relied on his immigrant community for support, took time to learn English, maintained his cultural traditions, and gradually built a better life for his family. She gathered her documents into a neat stack, but she wasn't finished delivering her devastating critique. The only meaningful difference between Carl Carlson and the immigrants you attack every night on this show is about 130 years and the color of their skin. The studio had fallen completely silent. Even the production crew seemed to be holding their breath as they witnessed one of the most devastating takedowns in cable news history. Social media was already exploding as clips of the exchange began circulating online. But Omar wasn't finished. She had one more revelation that would complete her demolition of Carlson's anti-immigration narrative. There's one more thing your viewers should know, Tucker, she said, pulling out a final document that appeared to be aged and official. This is Carl Carlson's petition for citizenship, filed in 1894. In it, he wrote about his gratitude to America for giving him opportunities he never could have had in Sweden. He wrote about his commitment to American values and his determination to contribute to his new country. She looked up at Carlson, who remained silent, clearly unwilling to walk further into what had become a complete trap. Do you know what values he specifically mentioned in his petition? Carlson said nothing, his expression a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and what looked like genuine confusion about how the interview had gone so completely off the rails. He wrote about religious freedom, the right to worship as he chose without government interference. He wrote about the right to speak freely without fear of persecution. He wrote about the opportunity for anyone willing to work hard to build a better life for their children, regardless of their background or the circumstances of their birth. Omar's voice grew stronger as she continued, building to what would become the climax of her argument. He wrote about America as a beacon of hope for people around the world who were seeking freedom and opportunity. He described America as a nation that was strongest when it welcomed people who were fleeing oppression and seeking a better life. The irony was complete and devastating. Carlson, who had built his career arguing that recent immigrants couldn't understand real American values, was confronting evidence that his own immigrant ancestor had articulated those values more clearly and more eloquently than Carlson himself often did. In other words, Tucker, your own great-great-grandfather understood America exactly the way I understand it, as a country that is strongest when it welcomes people who are fleeing oppression and seeking opportunity, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the studio and the millions of viewers watching at home. So when you tell me to go back to Somalia, Omar continued, her voice steady but with an edge of steel that cut through the silence. When you question whether I understand American values, when you suggest that only people whose families have been here for generations can truly be American, you're not just attacking me. Another pause, more dramatic than the first. You're attacking the same values that brought your own family to this country. You're attacking the same dreams that motivated Carl Carlson to leave everything he knew and risk everything for a chance at a better life in America. The camera captured Carlson's expression, a mixture of shock, anger, and what looked like genuine confusion. For perhaps the first time in his media career, he appeared to be completely at a loss for words. The man who had built his reputation on always having a quick comeback, always being ready with a cutting response, sat in stunned silence. Omar leaned back in her chair, her point made with surgical precision. But she had one final question that would serve as the coup de grace to Carlson's anti-immigration arguments. So tell me, Tucker, if Carl Carlson were alive today, if he were arriving at the border with no money, no English skills, no job prospects, and no guarantees, if he were seeking asylum from economic hardship and political instability in Sweden, would you tell him to go back where he came from? The question was rhetorical, but its power was undeniable. In the span of just a few minutes, Omar had completely dismantled Carlson's anti-immigration narrative using his own family history. She had shown that the very arguments he used against modern immigrants could be applied to his own ancestor, and that the values he claimed to defend were the same values that had motivated his great-great-grandfather to immigrate to America. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Carlson finally found his voice. When he spoke, the bombastic confidence that had characterized his earlier statements was completely gone. This is a hit job, he said, his voice lacking its usual conviction and authority. You've taken selective pieces of information and tried to create a narrative that... Tucker, Omar interrupted gently, her tone now more sympathetic than combative. These are public records. Immigration documents, naturalization papers, newspaper articles, census data, all available to anyone who cares to look. I haven't created any narrative. I've simply presented the facts about your family's immigration experience. She held up the folder containing all the documents. The same kinds of facts that you use every night to argue against immigration. The same kinds of stories that you dismiss when they belong to people who look like me. Carlson's producer was frantically gesturing from behind the cameras, clearly wanting to cut to commercial, but the host seemed frozen in place, unable to process what had just happened to him. The truth is, Tucker, Omar continued, driving home her final point. Immigration has always been messy, complicated, and challenging. It was true for your great-great-grandfather, and it's true for families arriving today. The rhetoric was the same. The fears were the same. The economic concerns were the same. She stood up from her chair, the interview clearly over as far as she was concerned. But throughout our history, America has been strongest when we've remembered that we're all part of the same story. The story of people who came here seeking something better, whether that was 130 years ago or 130 days ago. Omar gathered her papers and looked directly into the camera, speaking to the millions of viewers rather than to Carlson. So the next time you want to tell someone to go back where they came from, maybe you should remember Carl Carlson. and ask yourself whether you really want America to go back to a time when immigrants like your own great-great-grandfather were told they didn't belong here. The camera held on Carlson's stunned expression as Omar walked off the set, leaving him sitting alone at his desk for the first time in Tucker Carlson Tonight's history. The host, who had made his career on having the last word, appeared to have been rendered completely speechless. As the show finally cut to commercial, the studio buzzed with shocked energy that was unlike anything the veteran crew had ever experienced. Production assistants whispered to each other in amazement. Crew members exchanged wide-eyed looks of disbelief. And in the control room, executives were already fielding frantic calls from network brass, trying to understand what had just happened on live television. The immediate aftermath was unlike anything Fox News had experienced in its history. Within minutes of the segment ending, social media erupted in a way that political observers had never seen before. The hashtag Carl Carlsson began trending on Twitter, along with hashtag Omar Destroys Carson, hashtag Immigrant History, and hashtag Tucker Exposed. Clips of the confrontation were being shared across every platform at a rate that threatened to crash some social media servers. The most viral clip showed the exact moment when Omar revealed the Ellis Island records, zooming in on Carlson's face as his own words about immigration were contradicted by his family's actual history. The video was shared over 100,000 times in the first hour alone, with view counts climbing into the millions as the night progressed. Conservative Twitter was in complete chaos. Many of Carlson's most loyal supporters felt betrayed and confused by the revelation about his family history. Comments poured in expressing shock and disappointment. A popular conservative influencer posted, "I've been watching Tucker for years, and I feel like I've been lied to. His great-great-grandfather was literally the kind of immigrant Tucker says we shouldn't allow in. I don't know what to believe anymore." Even some of his media allies were backing away. Tucker walked into this one. You can't attack immigrants and then get exposed for having the exact same immigration story in your own family. Liberal Twitter, meanwhile, was celebrating Omar's masterful takedown as one of the most effective political performances they had ever witnessed. The praise was effusive and widespread. A Democratic strategist tweeted, "Ilhan Omar just delivered the most devastating political takedown I've ever seen. She didn't just win that debate. She exposed the fundamental hypocrisy behind modern anti-immigration rhetoric." A prominent journalist posted, "The way Omar stayed calm while systematically destroying Carlson's entire worldview was a masterclass in political communication. She came prepared with facts and let them speak for themselves." A civil rights attorney wrote, "What we just witnessed was more than a debate victory. Omar used Carlson's own family history to defend every immigrant who has ever been told they don't belong in America." But perhaps the most significant reactions came from the immigration community itself. For millions of Americans who had faced discrimination based on their immigrant backgrounds, Omar's performance represented a powerful moment of vindication. She had shown that even the most vocal critics of immigration often had their own immigrant stories. They had just forgotten or chosen to ignore them. Maria Santos, a DACA recipient from Texas, tweeted, "Watching Ilhan Omar expose Tucker Carlson's family immigration story was everything. My family faces the same challenges his great-great-grandfather did, but we're treated like criminals instead of dreamers." Ahmed Hassan, a Somali-American community leader in Minnesota, posted, "What Omar did tonight wasn't just about winning a debate. She reminded America that we're all part of the same story. My children will grow up knowing that even Tucker Carlson's family needed America's compassion once." The broader political implications were immediate and far-reaching. Democratic leaders seized on the moment as definitive evidence of the hypocrisy behind anti-immigration rhetoric. Within hours, statements were pouring in from across the political spectrum. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi tweeted, "Thank you at Ilhan Omar for reminding us that America's strength has always come from our diversity and our shared immigrant heritage. Tonight you spoke for every family that has ever been told they don't belong here." Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer posted, "What we witnessed tonight was the power of truth over rhetoric." Congresswoman Omar showed that anti-immigrant sentiment often comes from people who have forgotten their own family's stories. Even some moderate Republicans found themselves in an awkward position. Senator Susan Collins of Maine issued a carefully worded statement. "Tonight's exchange reminds us that immigration has always been part of the American story. We should approach these issues with more humanity and historical perspective. But it was the reaction from Trump himself that perhaps carried the most political weight. The former president, known for his loyalty to media allies, found himself in an impossible position. Carlson had been one of his most devoted supporters, but Omar had just used factual family history to devastate his anti-immigration arguments. Trump's response, posted to Truth Social 3 hours after the debate, was characteristically unpredictable. Tucker got ambushed tonight with his own family history. Very unfair, but maybe we all need to remember that legal immigration built America. The Carlsons came here legally, just like we want people to do today. Different times, but same American dream. The statement was widely interpreted as Trump attempting to maintain support for both Carlson and controlled immigration while acknowledging the power of Omar's argument. But many saw it as a subtle distancing from Carlson's more extreme rhetoric. Republican primary candidates across the country found themselves being asked the Carlson question: how they would respond to attacks on the Americanness of legal immigrants who had served their country with distinction. Many struggled to answer without either abandoning their base or sounding hypocritical. The confrontation also sparked a broader conversation about American identity and belonging that extended far beyond political circles. Op-ed writers across the political spectrum began examining their own family immigration stories, and genealogy websites reported a surge in people researching their ancestors' arrival in America. The website Ancestry.com reported a 400% increase in immigration-related searches in the 48 hours following the debate. A spokesperson said, "People want to understand their own family's immigration stories. Many are discovering that their ancestors faced similar challenges to immigrants today." Ellis Island's online records database crashed multiple times due to unprecedented traffic as Americans sought to understand their own family's immigration experiences. The National Archives reported similar spikes in requests for historical immigration documents. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange had shifted the terms of the immigration debate itself. Instead of being a conversation about us versus them, Omar had forced America to confront the reality that they were often just earlier versions of us. The revelation that even the most vocal critics of immigration had their own immigrant family stories made it much harder to maintain the simplistic narratives that had dominated political discourse. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a political scientist at American University, noted, "What Omar accomplished was remarkable from a strategic standpoint. She didn't just win a debate. She reframed the entire immigration conversation by forcing Americans to confront their own family histories." In the days following the confrontation, investigative journalists began digging deeper into not just Carlson's family history, but the immigration stories of other prominent anti-immigration voices. What they found was a consistent pattern. Many of the loudest critics of immigration had their own family stories of struggle, discrimination, and gradual acceptance in America. The Washington Post published a comprehensive investigation titled "The Immigration Stories They Forgot," documenting the family histories of a dozen prominent immigration restrictionists. The findings were stunning. A prominent anti-immigration congressman whose great-grandfather had been denied entry twice before being admitted. A popular conservative commentator whose family had relied on ethnic community support networks identical to those she now criticized. A state attorney general whose ancestors had been accused of the same failure to assimilate rhetoric he now used against modern immigrants. The revelation sparked what some historians called the Great Immigration Reckoning, a moment when America was forced to confront the gap between its immigration mythology and its current immigration politics. Meanwhile, Carlson himself had remained conspicuously silent since the confrontation. His usual active social media presence had gone dark, and Fox News had announced that he would be taking a previously unscheduled vacation from his show. Industry insiders reported that he was in crisis management mode, working with his legal team and publicists to figure out how to respond to the devastating exposure of his family history. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Tucker Carlson returned to his show with a carefully crafted statement that represented one of the most significant reversals in cable news history. Gone was his usual bombastic confidence, replaced by a more subdued tone that suggested the encounter had genuinely affected him. 3 weeks ago, Congresswoman Omar presented information about my family's immigration history that I had never fully considered in the context of modern immigration debates, he said, looking directly into the camera with an expression that was notably more serious than his usual presentation. I've spent these weeks reflecting on what that means, both for my family's story and for my own views on immigration policy and rhetoric. He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully as millions of viewers waited to see how he would address the elephant in the room. The truth is, I had heard pieces of my great-great-grandfather's story growing up, but I had never really connected it to the modern immigration debate. I never thought about what it meant that he arrived with nothing, that he was initially rejected, that he relied on other immigrants for support, that he maintained his Swedish customs while gradually becoming American. It was a remarkable admission from someone who had built his career on having strong opinions about everything. I think that's true for a lot of Americans. We know our families came from somewhere else, but we don't always think about what that journey was like or how it compares to immigration today. We forget that our ancestors were once the foreigners, once the people who didn't speak English perfectly, once the ones being told they didn't understand American values. Carlson continued with what amounted to the closest thing to an apology his audience had ever heard from him. I still believe America needs to control its borders, and I still think we need to have serious conversations about immigration policy. But I also think Congresswoman Omar was right about one thing. We need to have those conversations with more humanity and more recognition of our shared history. The statement was notable not just for its content, but for its tone. The combative, dismissive attitude that had characterized Carlson's approach to immigration had been replaced by something more thoughtful and nuanced. The man who had made his career on attacking immigrants was publicly acknowledging that his own family's story complicated his narrative. Going forward, I'm going to try to remember that behind every immigration statistic is a human being with hopes and dreams not so different from what my great-great-grandfather had when he arrived here in 1887. The statement drew mixed reactions from his audience. Some praised him for his honesty and growth, while others felt betrayed by what they saw as capitulation to liberal pressure. But most observers agreed that the Tucker Carlson who returned to television was notably different from the one who had been humbled by Omar's research. For Omar, the victory was complete but not vindictive. When asked about Carlson's statement during a later interview on CNN, she responded with characteristic grace. "I'm glad Tucker took the time to reflect on our conversation. That's exactly what I was hoping for, not to destroy anyone personally, but to create space for a more honest conversation about who we are as Americans and what our values really mean." She continued, "The goal was never to embarrass Tucker Carlson. The goal was to remind America that immigration isn't about us versus them. It's about us, period. We're all part of the same story, whether our families arrived 400 years ago or 4 years ago." The confrontation between Tucker Carlson and Ilhan Omar became more than just a viral political moment. It became a case study in the power of preparation, the importance of historical context, and the possibility of changing minds through facts rather than fury. Political communication experts began studying the encounter as a masterclass in strategic messaging. Dr. Sarah Chun, who teaches political communication at Georgetown University, noted, "Omar accomplished something incredibly difficult. She completely reframed a hostile interview by using the interviewer's own background against his arguments. It was surgical in its precision. The technique became known in political circles as the Omar method, using an opponent's own history or contradictions to expose the flaws in their argument. Campaign strategists across the country began incorporating similar research tactics into their opposition research operations. For millions of Americans watching that night, the exchange was a reminder that the immigration debate wasn't about abstract policy questions, but about real families with real stories, including, as it turned out, the families of those who had forgotten their own immigration history. The lesson was clear. In America, we're all part of the same story, whether we remember it or not. And sometimes it takes someone who remembers their own journey to remind the rest of us of the journeys that brought all of our families here. Students at journalism schools across the country were required to watch the confrontation as an example of how research and preparation could level any playing field. The Columbia School of Journalism added the Omar Carlson debate to its required curriculum, using it to teach students about the power of factual preparation in combating hostile interviews. But perhaps the most important outcome was the broader shift in how Americans talked about immigration. The revelation that even the most vocal critics of immigration had their own immigrant family stories had made it much harder to maintain the us versus them narrative that had dominated the debate for years. Polling conducted 6 months after the confrontation showed a measurable shift in American attitudes toward immigration. A Gallup poll found that 67% of Americans agreed with the statement, "Most American families have immigration stories that are similar to immigrants today," compared to 48% who agreed with that statement before the Carlson-Omar debate. The same poll found that support for comprehensive immigration reform had increased by 12 percentage points across party lines, with the biggest increases among Republicans who described themselves as strong conservatives. As one political analyst noted in The Atlantic, Ilhan Omar didn't just win a debate that night. She reminded America of something we had forgotten about ourselves, that we're all immigrants, we're all Americans, and those two things have never been contradictory. The story of Carl Carlsson, the Swedish immigrant who arrived with nothing and built a life that would eventually produce a primetime television host, became a symbol of the American dream in action. But more than that, it became a reminder that the American dream doesn't belong to any particular group or time period. It belongs to anyone willing to work for it, regardless of when they arrived or where they came from. Museums across the country began incorporating the Carlson family story into their immigration exhibits. The Ellis Island Immigration Museum created a special display about the immigration stories we forgot, featuring Carl Carlson's documents alongside those of other immigrant families whose descendants had become prominent critics of immigration. The exhibit's curator, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, explained, "The Carlson story resonated because it forced Americans to confront the contradiction between their family histories and their current political positions. It reminded us that yesterday's immigrants faced the same challenges and criticisms as today's immigrants." In the end, Omar had achieved something remarkable. She had used Tucker Carlson's own family history to defend not just her own right to be American, but the right of every immigrant to be part of America's ongoing story. And in doing so, she had reminded the country that America's greatest strength had always been its ability to take people from anywhere in the world and make them American, not by erasing their past, but by helping them write a new chapter in the great American story. The confrontation was over, but its impact would be felt for years to come. In a single evening, one prepared Congresswoman with a folder full of documents had changed how America talked about itself, its history, and its future. And Tucker Carlson? He learned that sometimes the most devastating argument against your position comes not from your enemies, but from your own family's story, a story that, once told, can never be untold. The final lesson of that extraordinary night was perhaps the most American lesson of all, that our strength comes not from building walls between us and them, but from recognizing that there is no them, there is only us, Americans all, bound together by the same dreams that brought Carl Carlson from Sweden in 1887 and continue to bring families to America today. As Omar concluded in her final statement to the cameras that night, America doesn't belong to any one group of people. It belongs to everyone who believes in its promise and is willing to work to fulfill it. That's what my family believed when we came here. It's what Tucker's family believed when they came here. And it's what families arriving today believe. We're all part of the same American story. The debate was over, but the conversation about what it means to be American had just begun.